Congressman Chris Smith has been, without question, the shining light on pro-life issues in the United States Congress for over 30 years. He is hugely respected on all sides of the political divide for his measured but also highly effective approach. Congressman Smith has authored 47 laws. That's the second highest among all 435 members of the House of Representatives over the last 2 decades. In addition to championing numerous laws on the protection of life for unborn children, he is a tireless advocate for children and indeed for adults with special needs. He is also the author of several landmark anti-human trafficking laws. He has also been a true friend of Ireland. From the day he entered Congress, he took a real keen interest in the peace process and as an encourager and indeed a guide to the pro-life movement here. In 2015, he was the keynote speaker at the Pro-Life Campaign's National Conference. It is a tremendous honour today to have with us Congressman Smith. And it's great now to be joined, well, virtually joined in studio by Congressman Chris Smith. I think Congressman Smith, just everybody with us today that's watching, after just hearing that introduction of all you have achieved in your political career to date, it kind of makes people take a deep breath saying, my goodness, where do you get the energy and the drive for all these achievements?
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thanks for having me for this virtual meeting. It's a privilege, and good to see you again, having been interviewed by you in 2015. Frankly, it comes from faith. It comes from the inspiration that I draw from my wife. We work as a team. I have a tremendous family that is very supportive, very providing insights. And it's all about motivation. The motivation is to try to the best of our ability. We all do it. Do His will on earth as it is in heaven, which means we need to be tenacious, smart. We have to have love and compassion, even for those who hate us. Probably the hardest thing that I have to do is I've run 22 times for Congress. I lost the first one in '78, but won ever since, is to really love those who hate you. Love those who persecute you. And that is probably the hardest thing of all. But overcoming all of that, knowing that, we serve a tremendous God who loves us and has given us mercy and peace and reconciliation. All of that is the biggest motivators of all. The scripture that motivates me the most on pro-life is Matthew 25, where our Lord admonished us to care for the least of our brethren. And of course, he was talking situationally, those who are at risk or vulnerable. Who is more vulnerable than a baby inside the womb or a newborn? And I also look, as you do, as the mothers, as the co-victims of every abortion. So that motivates to try to protect and to safeguard the weakest and the most vulnerable.
One of the things, Congressman, I think that's so inspirational about the work that you have done is you're very much authentic on this idea of being pro-life for the whole life. Is this something that we really need to focus on as a pro-life community?
Well, I think, like the churches of various denominations, the whole idea is to be consistent. Those at risk, those who are vulnerable, whether it be newborns or 5-year-olds, children or individuals with autism, trafficking victims, to make sure that we reach out and put our arms around them with law, with policy, and of course, with everything else we can provide to be their advocate and their friend. There's too much abandonment going on in society today. And I have always argued that the abortion culture is one of abandonment, just pushing the child aside, calling it choice to do what? Kill a baby, wound a mother. That's abandonment. So, I think this consistent ethic of life, Pope John Paul II summarized it so beautifully when he used to talk about the culture of life versus the culture of death. We are part of the culture of life. We love people, and we want to help those who are at risk. So it all comes from the scriptures. It all comes from the teachings of Jesus Christ.
Congressman, I know one thing that many people watching today will be interested in is when you consider just, as you mentioned earlier, the incremental changes that you have had to work on over the years to try and really win back a culture of life. Where is a good place to start, or what were the incremental changes that you felt were the most powerful?
Great question, Wendy. The first and foremost was public funding and conscience rights. And very quickly in the late 70s, Henry Hyde's leadership was instrumental in this. We cut off funding for abortion, which did cause a lot of children who otherwise would have been killed by abortion to live. Subsidization, and the studies show it, leads to about a 25% or so reduction in the number of abortions. So, and conscience rights, empowering hospitals, individuals, entities of every kind to say, no, we want no complicity, no part in the killing of these children and the wounding of their moms, is a very, very essential part as well. We had 8 long years, Wendy, of Obama, who refused to enforce the conscience rights of the United States of America. We had multiple meetings with his top people. They simply said, no, we're not going to do it. A law is supposed to be enforced. If they want to change the law, well, they're welcome to try. They didn't want to change it. They just didn't want to enforce it. So conscience rights. And then there's things like women's right to know laws, so that a woman prior to that irreversible decision gets information in her hand about the growth and development of an unborn child. We hope that there would be an ultrasound or some other diagnostic tool like it, where you hear the heartbeat. And that does, again, cause a rethinking of that decision. And then waiting periods have been shown, as well as requiring parental notification or consent for a minor's abortion, have saved many, many teenagers from getting abortions when their parents become a part of that, and they look for solutions rather than a violent solution, which is abortion. So all of those best practices, while all of us work to try to change our law, we have tried. I'm the prime sponsor of the Unborn Child Pain Capable Protection Act, which would cut off abortions at 20 weeks, which is unconscionably high, but it's until birth in the United States. And there are many kids who survive later term abortions, and they are treated as so much garbage by the abortionist. There was a case out of Florida where the director of the clinic took this baby who was gasping for breath and threw the baby into a biohazard bag and threw the baby out while still gasping for air. We had Gosnell, an abortionist in Philadelphia, who routinely would snip the back part of the child's brainstem for all of the live births that resulted in his abortion mill in Philadelphia. He frankly is in jail now, but it took decades to bring him to justice and to stop that inhumanity and that barbaric behavior. So all of these laws are steps, but of course our ultimate goal is to try to say we need to see birth as an event, not the beginning of life. Human life begins at conception, and every single week that baby grows and develops, and life is that too. It's a continuum.
It's interesting, Congressman, just that you're obviously talking about making sure that we focus on the laws and those incremental changes. That's one really important piece. But the other part, of course, is winning hearts and minds, of just the average person.
Yes.
In terms of communicating the pro-life message, what do you think has been the most effective in your experience in that real effort to try and change the culture?
Well, I think, we live in a society that watches television ads and watches TV and all kinds of mass media. Getting the message out through social media as well as on television and radio advertising changes hearts and minds. There are a number of organizations in America, including the Vitae Foundation, which actually produces great ads. And when they run those ads, particularly when they saturate a market with those ads, we see, and they do it empirically with polling, a movement in our direction that is very significant. So we need to sustain that. There are always people who are not acquainted with this before, maybe never focused on it, or it might be a woman who's in that situation where she's being pressured to have an abortion. Knowing that there's alternatives like pregnancy care centers as part of that ad is a great way. I think our churches need to redouble their efforts to preach the gospel of life, to tell the story from the pulpits and in the synagogues and throughout all of the faith community about the sanctity of life, and to do it not just once a year or once every 5 years, but to do it consistently. Human rights freedom of religion, assembly, speech, they're all important, but they are all contingent on the right to life, the right to continue living once that tremendous, beautiful process has begun. So all the others kind of collapse if you can't live. So I think getting that message out and then doing everything we can in debate, getting people in Parliament, forming a pro-life caucus like I run in the House, and I know you have them as well, so that people in parliaments all over the world, including in Ireland, take real control over monitoring what's happening and pushing back and being, very tenacious in saying we will not bend. I'll give an example. We don't have a majority in the House now for life. Democrats took control, and we have a decided pro-abortion majority. The Senate is very questionable with a slim pro-life majority on some issues. But we have a president in Trump who is the most pro-life president we've ever had. Like him or not, that is a fact. Well, he put out a statement, and we backed it up with our signatures that said any weakening of any existing pro-life policy or law, veto it, and we'll sustain your veto. And we have enough votes in both the House and the Senate to sustain any veto on any bill. And that last Congress and last year, again, made all the difference when all this terrible reversal language was contained in our annual appropriations bill. So, our Lord admonished us to be wise as serpents, yet gentle as doves. We have to have strategies that can prevail. I'm always very mindful
I suppose,
that
of strategies, Congressman Smith, it's really heartening just to hear of the things that worked. But is there any lessons that you've learned in the United States of mistakes that have been made that you would say to people in Ireland, don't do this?
Oh, great question again, Wendy. Probably the biggest mistake we've made over the years, we made it big time in 1980. We made it when we had a difference of opinion about strategy. And I wouldn't say it shattered the movement, but it set us back significantly. We need to have unity and to strive, even when we have differences of opinion about best strategies. Just rally. We're all for each other. Every group, every individual that is trying to save life, we're all in this together, and we got to let any kind of ego. And we've had it here in the United States. We've had groups that have split, including in my own state of New Jersey, when the two pro-life groups split over strategy. That set us back. Who does that help? It helps the abortion movement. So we have to find a way every time, even when there's a disagreement, to be amicable and civil and say, okay, I may not think that's the best approach, but we're all in this together. We need to be unified. So unification of our message to the greatest extent possible, and think the best of each other. This is a hard fight. It's a long fight, arduous, but we need to.
And politically, Congressman, it's interesting that the pro-life issue is something that can cross borders and cross oceans. I mean, you yourself recently wrote to the Secretary of State in Northern Ireland. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes. Oh, sure. I was very disappointed that some of the parties, Sinn Féin in particular, took advantage of the situation that there was not a reconvening in Stormont, and the House of Commons passed a bill that said if they don't do it by a date certain, they will impose the Abortion Control Act of 1967 or parts thereof on that. That was, Ireland, that was devolved. The whole issue of what does Northern Ireland do on abortion was devolved to the legislature, and it should stay there. It should not be imposed upon by the members of the House of Commons. So it was also included in that some very, very, I think, inaccurate language from the CEDAW, which is the UN Treaty on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which opined that they needed to change their law as well. CEDAW has no mandate to do that. There's nothing in the treaty itself. The treaty body members moonlight often and tell countries they need to provide for expanded access to abortion. So that was like, why is this? Why are they doing this? And they should have ignored it. There's nothing in the CEDAW that was obligatory on abortion at all, and yet, it became a talking point for the abortion rights movement. I did write to the Secretary for Northern Ireland, asking him not to go ahead with new laws, but he did it anyway. And I was deeply disappointed as someone who believes in human rights from womb to tomb and fought very hard for human rights in Northern Ireland, that there be a fair policing. I had 14 hearings on policing to make sure that it was non-sectarian. If somebody calls the police, you don't get somebody taking one side or the other. And so it's something I really believe in. I abhor violence of every kind. And here we have a new manifestation of violence being imposed by the British on Northern Ireland through a law by the House of Commons. So very, very disappointed in that. And again, my hope is, because there are some great pro-lifers in that parliament, that they'll redouble their efforts, and I know they are. Never take a defeat as definitive. We're not. I've been in the pro-life movement for 48 years. I got involved. My wife got involved in 1974, me in 1972. I am more shocked at what they do even then when I first became involved in this movement. The death toll in America is well over 60 million dead babies. That is more than all the people living in England have been killed by abortion in the United States. So when you realize the carnage and what has done to women and to babies, we just, Northern Ireland and you in Dublin need to fight because no injustice and no human rights abuse need not be forever.
I think that's probably just one of the most important messages for people watching today. Yeah. It is not definitive. And it's amazing to hear, Congressman, you talk about you came to Ireland in 1983, as you said, for around a week, and you were campaigning then for what you described in 2015, rightly so, as our 8th Amendment was the gem. We've lost that gem now. It doesn't mean we won't get it back. If you were to come back to Ireland and campaign with some of the people that are watching today, where would they start? How would they best speak with their feet?
Well, I think they need to be talking to the members of the parliament, all the parties. They need to look to alter elections, run candidates, and don't take no for an answer. We're fighting for a child's life to live and for a mother to be free from the agony that is often lifelong attributable to an abortion. When it comes to conscience votes, this ought to be a conscience vote and not a discipline vote. I remember some of the great members who lost their seats when they were disenfranchised from the party for breaking with the party on abortion. This is the human rights issue of our time. There's no other human rights abuse, because I work on all of them. I wrote 4 laws on torture victims, helping torture victims, lots of laws on trafficking, 5 of them. But in each one of those cases, when you confront a country or a society and say trafficking is wrong, sex or labor trafficking, they all agree. They may deny they're doing it, but they all agree it's a wrong. Abortion is the only human rights abuse that falsely asserts that it's a human right. And who gets hurt? Babies and mothers.
Finally, just to ask you, if there was one thing that people watching could take away from today going forward, what would it be?
Pray, fast, hard work, and we will save many, many children on the short term, intermediate term, and a culture of life will be the consequence. God will honor those prayers and that fasting and that hard work. We don't know the day or the hour, but as Mother Teresa often told us, we have to be faithful. And if we're faithful, I believe this culture of death will be dismantled.
Congressman Smith, thank you so much for your inspiring words, and indeed thank you for all that you have done for the cause of life and for so many other important human rights causes and the work that you'll continue to do. Thank you for giving us your time today.
Wendy, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Good morning to you for sure, right, Congressman?
Good morning, Wendy. And I've watched the entire show. It's been great. Very, very good webinar. And can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So thank you so much, and appreciate the interview and your great work, all of your great work. And good to see Rónán. This is the first time I've ever heard Rónán speaking. I could not hear him. He is so articulate. It's so persuasive that we can't hear him.
One of the things, Congressman Smith, that might be interesting for you to just reflect on with the fact that we have Senator Mullen and I think hopefully Deputy Nolan with us as well, is we just mentioned there and questions came in about, you know, interventions that Senator Mullen and Deputy Nolan in recent weeks have made, you know, asking pertinent questions of government representatives and finding really the situation where they're hitting a brick wall, or those questions are being not taken seriously enough. Because we have such a small number of pro-life politicians at the moment, small but very strong, strong representatives, what's your advice there in terms of them trying to just break through when there's very little interest from our current political representation in even answering their questions?
Great question, Wendy. And, you know, it's like the Berlin Wall, that was never going to come down. And I remember those vivid pictures as people were hitting it, it eventually was toppled. Just keep asking those questions, keep asking good questions, be persistent, always respectful, which I know Rónán and the pro-life leaders are. And again, you know, I decided, like Rónán and so many others, back in the 70s and into the 80s, that I wasn't just going to be on the outside, out on the streets, so to speak. I was going to try to get into the suites and actually be a member. So there are people on this webinar that I hope would consider either themselves or for a friend to run. You know, we live in democracies, representative democracies, where it does make a difference. And if you run and you really apply yourself 1,000%, you can win. I lost the first time. I ran somebody else's campaign in '76. He lost, and third time was a charm, and won in 1980. So I greatly encourage that kind of participation as well, and also becoming staff members. You know, we all heavily rely on good, solid staff. You know, my wife rewrites every speech I ever write. She's sitting right over here. And you know, so it's good to have a good team around you. But just keep asking those questions. Pressure, use social media, hold them to account on their social media, which I think is helpful with good, respectful questions. But we just don't go away, ever.
Congressman, I'm not surprised that there's been huge reaction from the hundreds of panelists that are joining us today to the interview that we did yesterday. Sheila, maybe do you want to try and get to one or two of those questions for Congressman Smith? You're muted, Sheila. Sheila, you're muted.
Apologies.
No,
yeah, I think everybody is just very grateful to hear from Congressman Smith. You can hear me now? Yeah, people are just, you know, huge fans. You know, here in Ireland, we look very closely across the waters at what happens in the States. It's certainly something that we can learn from, and it's wonderful to see the work you're doing. So we have a lot of people just thanking you for the stance that you have taken and the incredible work that you have done over many years, Congressman. One question that Petra Conroy is asking that reflects some of the views with regards to Irish politicians and what advice you would have in terms of, I suppose, activists in the past have seen promises being made by Irish politicians that may very well be personally, to an extent, pro-life in their own personal lives, and maybe, you know, in their hearts possibly do believe in the right to life. But when it comes to the throes of political life and their own personal political ambitions, they tend to vote and go with the consensus and the political consensus. What advice would you give to campaigners and activists when speaking to politicians like this, and maybe you know, a strategy for us going forward when speaking to people who take this?
Well, I think the whole false concept of being personally opposed to abortion, but then publicly enabling it, paying for it, promoting it, making sure that it is maximized in terms of access, is such a false narrative that must be pierced. Ask them every time, why are you personally opposed? I remember the man that I replaced, my wife and I met with him, his name was Congressman Frank Thompson. And he says, oh, I'm personally opposed. He kept talking about that. And that was really the Ted Kennedy mantra that picked up and Governor Mario Cuomo when they concocted this idea of somehow you could be a dual person. Ask them why. What is it about abortion that you find objectionable that would lead to your opposition? And I often will raise the issue, well, can you apply personal opposition to child abuse for a 2-year-old? I'm personally opposed to child abuse, but I'm not going to pass a law that puts protections around a little child from that kind of abuse. We've got to make sure they understand that abortion is violence against children. Every debate I'm in Congress, and there are many times a year in committee as well as on the floor of the House and in press conferences and everywhere else, I always talk about the methods of abortion. It's dismemberment. A child is dismembered. You know, in Unplanned, some of you may have seen the movie about the woman who left Planned Parenthood, Abby Johnson, who worked there for 8 years. She shows an ultrasound guided abortion, and you see the baby literally ripped in half. We need to remind people that that is violence. And then, of course, what it does to a woman is just terrible for so many, for so long, unless they find reconciliation and hope again, which is what this movement is all about. We love them both. I love your phrase, love both. So hold them to account. I think that's key, and say that it's just apply personal opposition to any other abuse, and it's just not acceptable. So, but that really was, that whole argument was concocted on this side of the pond by Ted Kennedy, Father Drinan, and all these other people who were vociferously pro-abortion, and they came up with this idea of saying that you're against it, but I empathize. Well, then it ought to have consequences in your policy making.
Wendy, we can't hear you now. Your audio must be off.
Sorry, I'm back. One of the things that I think both Senator Mullen and Congressman Smith and Deputy Nolan, if we can find her out there, might answer is, how do we get across the message? Because Congressman Smith, as you mentioned, you know, after your first attempt that failed, but every year after that you've been re-elected. Senator Mullen, in the most recent election for himself, had an incredible win. But this is something I think that Irish politicians are too quick to forget, that actually, if you really drill down into the statistics, that pro-life politicians aren't kind of losing their seats because of their pro-life position when they're so well-rounded and their other work kind of stands up as well. What's the best way of getting that message across? By encouraging, and to refer back to that earlier question from Petra, encouraging politicians that are almost afraid to assert their pro-life position to step out of the closet.
To me? Yeah. Okay, well, I would say that be very upfront, but not in an affronting way. I try to emphasize the empathy with the baby as well as the mother. And frankly, it is not the abortion issue and our position on right to life. It's a winning issue. It's not a losing issue. And I think I've been testimony to that in districts that when polling is done, the polling comes back highly suggesting that I don't have a pro-life district. But I think when you ask the hard questions, under what circumstances do you think abortion should be permitted, most people, except for the very hard cases, and that's why in Ireland they used the very hard case to get an abortion on demand. That's what they did in the United States. But there is a support for abortion in very hard cases, not for socioeconomic reasons, and I think, or for birth control reasons. So we need to, it was Richard Workland, who was President Reagan's pollster, who broke the, when you say, are you pro-life or pro-choice, the people to this day in the United States will identify with a majority that they're pro-choice. But Workland and his polling outfit, and others have done it since, began to say, okay, but what are the circumstances? And all of a sudden we found that overwhelming numbers of people were pro-life. Because they don't want it for all those reasons. They don't want it in the second trimester, they don't want it in the third, and they don't want it under most circumstances. Most people are against public funding in the United States. They are totally against it. 60% of Americans are against public funding for abortion.
Rónán, do you think there's parallels between what Congressman Smith is saying and in Ireland?
Yeah, well, let me just thank, first of all, Wendy, Chris Smith, for the wonderful leadership he's giving, not just in the United States, but to pro-life people all over the world. And to think that he has to face election every 2 years, my goodness, you know. But the people of New Jersey have shown tremendous wisdom. And thanks in particular, Chris, for the encouragement you give me and so many others. And thanks also for leading the way with that consistent ethic of life. Your work on only this week, we're learning how the Irish government's performance in the area of human traffic prevention has diminished in according to the US State Department's very important annual report on this matter. You have been a leading light in the fight for the human dignity of victims of human trafficking. So thanks for showing the way, because that's really the test and a challenge for pro-life people, I think, all over the world. That people need to believe us. They need we need to be credible, and that means that when we make our arguments, they're arguments that start with trying to understand what's going on in our listeners' heads as opposed to what's going on in our heads. Okay, that's going right back to the ancient Greeks when it comes to communication. Unless you create that channel of understanding with people where they feel that you're interested in what's bothering them, even if they're bothered by things you don't think they should be bothered about quite so much, that's so important. But that broad credibility that comes from caring for human beings from, as you say, Chris, from the womb to the tomb. So thank you for that. You asked me a specific question about are there parallels. There certainly are. Our countries are very different. Our legal systems are very different. But when you think that, you know, when we talk about, Chris and I are involved in political stuff, and Carol, who I'm glad to see back, because Carol is giving wonderful leadership as well and giving great hope to people like me as well, because, you know, as I said before,
we might jump to Carol, Senator, sorry to interrupt you, because we are very, very tight for time, and I know there's been so many questions, and we just have time for one final question before we sign off. Something that people might have heard of yet, Deputy Nolan, is the question that you recently asked the Minister for Health when we had those devastating figures of the 6,666 abortions that were carried out in Ireland. And you asked the Minister the question as to, well, what are they doing in order to try and reduce the number of abortions? And his response was very telling. You might share with us about that.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm still waiting for a response back from the HSE on that particular question. But what really concerns me is that what's happening with a lot of the leaders from parties is that they're promoting abortion and nearly trying to normalise it. There's absolutely no other alternative options, such as adoption, for women to pursue. It seems to be all one-way traffic. It worries me greatly. And indeed, the figure of 6,666 is nothing short of barbaric. And certainly, I'll keep asking the questions. And I just want to thank Congressman Smith for his input today. It's truly inspirational. And certainly, that's what we need to do. We need to ask the questions. And certainly, in my work, I'll keep doing so. There are huge concerns. And it does feel like, and I've said it before, that the political leaders are almost like sales reps for the abortion industry. There's just no alternatives at all put before women, no positive alternatives. Domestic adoptions are very, very low in Ireland, and there's many, many families and many couples who would dearly love to adopt children and they can't do so. And that needs to be questioned. It's something that I'd be very passionate about, and I'll continue to ask the questions.
Well, thank you very much to Deputy Nolan, Senator Rónán Mullen, and a huge thanks
Wendy,
as well.
can you hear me? It would be wrong of me not to say that Chris's wonderful wife, Marie, has just done so much service as well. Her parliamentary network for critical issues, I think it's pnci.org, is well worth a visit. So in thanking Chris, we need to thank Marie as well for the great work she's doing.
I agree.
So much. and thank you so much.
Always, Rónán. Thank you.
There she is. Give us a wave, Marie. And thank you so much to Congressman Smith. I think the message is very clear when we've listened to our esteemed panelists today, to the hundreds of people that are watching. It is that we need to get politically involved. Is that now more than ever is the time to be involved, engaged, and to push back. And just, I hope everybody leaves this discussion today motivated. So thank you so much.